Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. U.S. President Donald Trump signed legislation on Thursday evening to repeal the Caesar Act, a bill that placed sweeping sanctions on Syria. The act was first signed by Trump in 2019 during his first term in office and targeted the now deposed regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Trump's decision followed the Senate voting to repeal the act on Wednesday. Now, you may have heard that Assad has been overthrown. He lost power after a rebel offensive last December. Ahmed Ashara, who led the former al-Qaeda affiliate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham during the war, is now president. The fall of Assad led many in Washington to question whether the act was still needed. But some in Congress were cautious to remove the Caesar sanctions immediately due to questions about this new government. Now, Trump has a bit of a rapport with Shara. They've met a few times, and the president has removed many sanctions already and issued waivers for the Caesar Act. But a full repeal is seen by many in Syria as necessary to allow significant investment to flow into the country. So what does this mean for Syria? To answer, I went to Al Monitor contributor Danny Makki, who is currently in Damascus. We spoke after the Senate vote, but before Trump signed. Danny offers insights into the Syrian business community's confidence at present, the impact a full repeal may have on the country, and whether Syria will live up to the expectations set by the Trump administration as the sanctions are taken away. Hope you enjoy. Danny and I spoke via voice message, which was easier given the state of internet currently in Damascus. I first asked him about the mood in the country after the Caesar vote, especially in the business community. Take a listen.
Well, I would say the mood in Damascus is definitely one of cautious optimism. People within the business communities, the merchant communities of Damascus and of Syria, the industrial sectors, they wouldn't really get too ahead of themselves based on the fact that these sanctions have been on Syria for a very, very long time. I mean, the earliest ones go back to the Syria Accountability Act, and even right back before that, well before 2003. Some of them go back, since the 80s. So the Caesar sanctions themselves have had a massive impact on the Syrian economy, and especially on the Syrian commerce and trade sectors. While people have been celebrating with the announcement that the sanctions will be completely repealed and lifted, it's also met with a lot of cautious optimism, because for Syrians, this isn't just one step. This is definitely a process. I mean, we're over 1 year after the fall of the Assad regime, the Assad government, and the fact that we're looking at these sanctions getting lifted 1 year on, tells you what you need to know. These sanctions have not helped with the rebuilding of the country. It's taken a very long time and a lot of effort to actually get here. And for many people living in the country, they're expecting to see an economic spike. They're expecting to see some positive economic signs, but I don't think anyone is going to get too far ahead of themselves. With the state of the current Syrian economy, it's going to take quite a while until they get back up to speed. And, as with most things in Damascus, people are very closely following the news. It's a huge obstacle which has now been crossed officially when the deal will be done and Trump will sign the documents. It will be a massive step for the future of the country, and essentially a fresh start for Syria, both economically and politically. The fact that these sanctions have been repealed is basically Syria's opportunity to emerge as a modern country all over again, and to really put to bed the many years of war, of hardship, of conflict, of issues that we've faced within the region, within our place as Syrians in the world. This is a great opportunity to put that to bed and to build something fresh, build something new, without having the huge burden of these massive sanctions. These sanctions were absolutely crippling the Syrian commerce sector. I mean, no one could deal with Syria. You couldn't have any business. Companies were really scared. Even in the first year in Damascus, I mean, we've seen the Saudis come back, the Qataris, the Americans, all of the Western states, but countries are still very skeptical of the economic situation. Businessmen and big companies are still very reluctant. They're scared to actually come back to Damascus because of the presence of these sanctions and because of the fact that, it's very ambiguous, the current situation. People don't know exactly how things are going to go with regards to these sanctions. The fact that they've been lifted is now really should be the catalyst for a massive economic revival in Syria.
The Caesar Act had a major impact on the Syrian economy. I therefore asked Danny how a repeal would affect that economy.
The impact of the Caesar sanctions have been unprecedented, partly because they've affected almost every facet of the economy related to Syria, and secondly because they've actually had a crushing impact which managed to aid with the collapse of the Assad regime, especially from an economic perspective. We know that when the Assad government was here in Damascus, the business elites related to the regime were running different networks and attempting to bypass these sanctions, and it just wasn't working because the sanctions legislation and the application of these sanctions was so powerful and really seeped into all sorts of different companies that would even consider investing in Syria. Russian, Chinese companies were all unable to even come into the country. So their impact on the day-to-day running of the Syrian economy was immense. It was very significant. Now, with the absence of these sanctions, it's essentially a clean slate. For Syria, it's basically another opportunity to show to the world again that Syria can be a reasonable actor, that Syria can make small economic achievements in different sectors in a very short space of time. I expect that while it will take some time for companies to come back to Syria and for trade to resume in a way that it probably was never before, because the Assad regime never really relied on the Western economic sphere, I think the current government will be looking towards the West, and especially the Gulf Arab countries, as they require a lot of funds for different projects, and Syria will slowly but surely start to craft itself as an attractive economic interest and an economic player in the region, which could draw different interests from specific financial entities in the Gulf, governments, private sectors, and especially to the West. I mean, Syria is placing itself in a position to be an economic hub for the region, one which is closely aligned politically to the Western countries and to most of the major Gulf Arab countries. While the Syrian economy itself will need decades to be fully rebuilt, we have a large percentage of our main infrastructure in the country is either outdated, is destroyed, is devastated, will require billions just to get it back to a state where it can actually resume basic transactions. I mean, even the internet connection in Syria is very old. The submarine cables which are feeding the internet connection into Syria have not been renewed in decades as well. So we need really a regrowth of our basic infrastructure in the country to be able to even handle an increased capacity in economic investment from the region, let alone from Western countries. And that's definitely something which will take time. This is not an overnight process. No one's expecting to wake up the next day after the sanctions are repealed and see the Syrian currency, in a state it was before 2011. That's something which is very unreasonable to expect. But at the same time, we expect a spike in terms of the economic progress, and we expect the Syrian pound to be in a much better situation. And we also expect a lot of investments to start gradually coming into the country as the fear of these sanctions slowly starts to get reduced and be alleviated completely with the signing of these documents. These sanctions have crippled the Syrian economy, and going forward, the absence of them is really a main starting point, a staging point, if you like, for Syria's reintegration into the regional and international economic fold.
The Syrian economy is devastated after the years of war. A rebuild of the country costs an estimated 216 billion, according to the World Bank, and 90% of the population is living in poverty. Here's Danny on the economic challenges the country will still face after Caesar is removed.
The economic challenges which face Syria are massive. They're huge. Not just relating to infrastructure and the fact that most of the economy has been devastated, it also goes back to having a strategy. Syria is definitely not in need of an immediate kind of fix. It's a country which is in desperate need for a 5-10 year plan to regenerate its power sources, to reintegrate its main economic infrastructure in the northeast, especially in the Kurdish areas. Syria is in desperate need of the oil fields. So a lot of this also rests on the economic situation, but it's jointly tied with the political status quo in the country. You have the coastal area, which is huge for tourism. You have a massive resource base in the coast. That's actually not entirely secure. It's not safe as of people are still reluctant in the coast to continue daily life and even grow. So that's a big issue. You've got Sweden, which is essentially cut off from the rest of the country. The economic challenges are massive, and they go back to the fact that the country is not yet united fully. There are still parts of the country which are facing issues, which are either suffering from being not under control of the Damascus government, or the areas which are still witnessing political instability. And that's something which will definitely have to change if the economic situation is to improve with the repealing of these Caesar sanctions. The Caesar Protection Act was a significant moment which helped to overthrow the Assad regime. And now the absence of these sanctions will actually really push Damascus into making the country more secure and stable as a whole. But this is going to require a lot of work, and it's not just economic, it's definitely political as well. The country needs to be united politically before it can be united economically, especially as a lot of these resources are not under the full control of Damascus. And that's definitely a significant immediate challenge for the Damascus government. Now, in terms of the other sanctions which are present on Syria, they'll gradually be taken off. So with that happening, Syria is going to unlock more economic opportunity, more economic capacity as well. As there's no limit on what it can do economically. And with other countries coming into the fold, you still got the Russians, the Chinese as well, other countries who are not just the West and the Gulf, who want to invest in the country and want to maintain proximity to Syria. This will be very significant going forward as well. But it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. And ultimately, the security and the situation being stable in many of these areas is key to the economy really rebuilding itself in the correct way. And there is a lot of talks about different projects which Damascus is doing or giving to specific sectors or individuals and entities. The best way for Syria to actually regrow its economy is, first of all, to upgrade the infrastructure. And second of all, it's actually to have a long-term plan, something which gives you achievable goals and results over a specific period, because this isn't going to happen overnight. And we know that the Damascene and the European merchant class have a very big say in the Syrian economy. And at the moment, we're seeing a lot of changes within Syria's domestic access, for example, manufacturing, goods, imports, technology, cars, for example, are all easily accessible now in Syria's economy. You have the working port in Tartus, in Latakia, the borders are now open. So a lot of infrastructure and technology can come into the borders, but at the same time, this needs to be regulated in the correct way. And the Syrian government needs to ultimately promote itself, promote its own population. And we need domestic initiatives. We need the domestic workforce working on these projects and working on the economy. And this is one of the crucial points to actually make sure Syria is stable over the long term, is to provide jobs and opportunities, especially in areas which were not completely happy with the presence of the new government in Damascus, such as the coast, for example. So a lot of this goes hand in hand with the economic and the political situation.
The language in the National Defense Authorization Act, which included the Caesar repeal, does not set conditions on Syria. But it does say the president must report to Congress every 6 months on Syria's progress on certain issues. Those issues include expelling foreign fighters, respecting minorities and relations with Israel, and fighting the Islamic State, or ISIS. Now, this could all prove tough. The conflict with Israel is not resolved, and the country still continues its attacks on Syria. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar recently said that the two countries are actually getting farther from a deal. A few days ago, a member of the Syrian state security forces affiliated with ISIS killed 2 U.S. soldiers and an interpreter in the country. And many in the Druze, Alawite, and other minority communities still distrust the government after the sectarian violence against them. Members of the Alawite community went on a strike earlier this month in protest of the government, and Druze groups in the southern Sweda province continue to defy calls to integrate into the new army. I asked Danny whether this new government can live up to the expectations, starting with the fight against ISIS.
Now, ultimately, the lifting of these sanctions comes at no easy cost, and that cost is the fact that Damascus must adhere to a number of different measures that the United States has set out. Among them is fighting ISIS, protecting minority rights, and refraining from actions against Israeli activity or Israeli actions. Now, in terms of the fight against ISIS, Syrians have definitely taken a lead in terms of trying to root out ISIS remnants around the country. This has been happening from Aleppo to Damascus, and obviously the latest incident, which ended up with the tragic loss of 3 US servicemen, is definitely a step backwards in terms of the general scope of Syrian security coordination with the United States of America. But the Syrian security forces themselves have an issue because a number of these different groups have elements which have been radicalized, which are linked to the Islamic State, which have loyalties to ISIS. Now, some of those individuals, some of those entities and groups are actually infiltrated within the Syrian Ministry of Defense and within the Syrian security forces. So how Damascus plans to root these individuals out, these individuals that now pose the biggest threat to Ahmad al-Shara's relationship with Washington and with Western countries, because attacks like the one which happened in Palmyra, which was essentially an infiltrator into Syrian security forces, posed the biggest threat to the relationship today. Now, Damascus has said that it will ultimately pledging that it will take a forward role in terms of fighting ISIS. They're now within the international global coalition to fight ISIS. And if anyone can fight ISIS, it's definitely the Syrian government, because they have experience of doing this in Idlib. They have experience of doing this for the last year. I mean, ever since they've come into power, they've been fighting ISIS remnants in different areas. And the more that the Syrian government, or the HTS affiliated groups, which then became the Syrian government, become more institutionalized and become members or essentially organs of the Syrian state, this will definitely provoke specific radical elements, both within their own supporters and the ranks of their own army, and from external entities and factors which may be linked to ISIS. So that will continue to happen, and the Syrian government will no doubt have a plan in place to fight these different remnants and groups. How it goes in terms of operations on the ground and preventing these kind of lone wolf infiltrator attacks is really going to be very interesting to observe over the future months and years, to see just how Damascus will deal with this. But they have history in fighting ISIS, and that's something which the Americans will no doubt have taken on board.
Here's what he said about the protection of minorities in Syria.
Now, in terms of the second point, which was the minority rights, and first of all, increasing stability in areas where there are minorities, and second of all, making sure minorities feel more, I would just add, involved within the Syrian process today. This is something where the Syrian government has a pretty atrocious record over the past year, and something which must really change sooner rather than later, not least because they're going to need these areas and this resource base to improve the Syrian economy, and second of all because there are a lot of major international entities and groups and countries such as the United States of America who are looking at this human rights record, especially in the minority areas, and thinking Damascus has to do better. Whether it's the Alawite areas and the coast, which obviously have witnessed massacres, abductions, summary executions, whether it's areas in Sweden where we've seen groups go in and burn people's houses. I mean, we've seen some atrocities over the past year from different areas conducted by different pro-government entities, and that's definitely one aspect which Damascus has to work harder on. Maybe that might go back to having more inclusivity, adding more minority groups and votes when it comes to making big decisions. And even if it's just a reshuffle, Syria's minorities today do not feel absolutely safe and secure and happy with the current country's state of affairs. And that's something which will definitely have to change if we are to complete a situation of harmony within the country. And that's definitely what is needed at the moment.
And finally, let's hear what Danny said about the security situation between Syria and Israel.
With regards to the potential repercussions of actions against Israel, we've definitely seen different posturing from the Syrian government over the past months. On the day of the anniversary of the liberation of Damascus, we saw military units in Damascus, Umayyan Square, chanting for Gaza. We've seen different commanders of the Syrian army come out at different moments, pledging to fight the Israelis and take the battle to the border. But at the same time, from a rational perspective, the United States would prefer to see less rhetoric coming out of Damascus and the groups that it is allied with in the country, and more decisions in terms of coming to security agreements, or whether that's a peace agreement. There's been talk of many agreements being signed or discussed, and this is set to happen in the next couple of months. But it remains to be seen how this is going to take place. You have the issue of the Golan Heights, and now you have Beijing, for example. The Israelis are regularly going into areas closer and closer to Damascus, abducting civilians, conducting raids. Airstrikes have kind of calmed down as of late, but they could come back at any specific moment. And I think the Americans want the Syrian government to really refrain from any provocation towards the Israelis. And I don't think it's in the Syrian government's best interest today as well to make any provocations against the Israelis. It would be far more prudent to just wait out and see if they can make a deal behind the scenes and then take it kind of from there. But at the same time, Damascus will probably be committed to all three of these different points. And the extent in terms of which of these points has more success than the other will ultimately be determined by Damascus's intent on these particular files, both individually and as a collective. But the United States will be watching all three of them and expecting Damascus to make big moves, whether it's in terms of the Israelis, whether in terms of, additionally fighting ISIS, conducting more raids. Maybe it's even arresting some of the members of the security forces who might be affiliated with ISIS. And especially in terms of minority rights, a lot of work needs to be done to, first of all, build the trust, and second of all, for Damascus to start to show that, we are a rational, civilized, international actor, and, when we give our word in terms of a specific topic, we're going to keep to our word. And that's the ultimate cost of these sanctions being lifted. Giving Syria a space and an opportunity to really rebuild the country, and at the same time giving them the responsibility to say that, look, if you don't do these specific points, we can take that freedom away, we can take that opportunity away, and that's something which will ultimately happen unless the Syrians really adhere to these points.
That concludes our interview. Thanks for listening to the Al Monitor Brief. Be sure to follow Al Monitor for more on the stories impacting the Middle East. Until next time, I'm Adam Lucente.